Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, find your most comfortable spot, and just settle in. Tonight, we're going to take a very slow, very quiet walk through the frozen plains of the American West. We're talking about the kind of cold that turns breath into ice crystals before they even leave your lips. Specifically, how the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains didn't just survive minus 30 degrees Celsius winters, but actually stayed quite cozy while the rest of the world probably would have just given up and turned into a popsicle. So let's talk about the teepee. Now, if you're picturing a simple tent, you're already giving it too little credit. The teepee was essentially a thermodynamic masterpiece designed by people who didn't have a degree from MIT, but did have a very vested interest in not freezing to death. Because, let's be honest, when it's minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit outside and the wind is howling across 1,000 miles of flat prairie with absolutely nothing to stop it, good enough is a death sentence. The art of the huddle. When you're living in a space that's maybe 20 feet across and you haven't stepped outside for more than a few minutes in 3 days because the air literally hurts your face, you learn a lot about your family. The teepee wasn't just a shelter, it was a social pressure cooker, but one designed for maximum chill. Because the teepee is a circle, there is no head of the table. Everyone is equal in the eyes of the fire. But there was a very specific, very quiet etiquette to it all. You moved clockwise. You didn't stand up and pace because that would disturb the layers of air we talked about. You stayed low, where the warmth was. It was a life lived at floor level, which honestly sounds like the dream if you're trying to catch some sleep. Let's talk about the bison robes again, because we really can't overstate how much these people owed to the buffalo. A singly winter robe was like a high-tech survival suit. They would tan the hides using the animal's own brain, because nature is nothing if not ironic and efficient, which made the leather as soft as a luxury flannel. Then they'd leave the thick, curly winter wool on the other side. Inside the teepee, you didn't just wear these, you lived in them. You'd have your day robe and your sleeping robe. When the temperature hit that minus 30 degrees centigrade mark, you double them up. The fur side always faced inward toward your body. Why? Because your body heat gets trapped in those hollow hairs and reflects right back at you. It's essentially a biomechanical furnace. You'd be sitting there, feeling like you're wrapped in a cloud, while 10 feet away a blizzard is trying to erase the world. And then there was the food. You can't stay warm on a salad. When it's that cold, your body is burning through calories just to keep your heart beating. Enter Pemmican. This was the ultimate prepper food long before that was a trend. It was lean, dried meat pounded into a powder, mixed with rendered fat and maybe some dried service berries. It sounds a bit like eating a greasy brick of sawdust, but it was the most calorie-dense substance on the planet. A few ounces of that and your internal temperature would spike. It was the wood for your body's fire. You'd be sitting there, slowly chewing on a piece of pemmican, watching the smoke curl toward the stars, and you'd feel that slow, heavy warmth spreading to your toes. It was the original comfort food, mostly because it literally kept you from becoming a human icicle. Let's float over to the light. There were no windows, obviously. During the day, the buffalo hides were translucent enough to let in a soft, parchment-colored glow. It was like living inside a giant lampshade. It was dim, moody, and perfect for napping. At night, the only light came from the central fire. This created massive, flickering shadows on the walls, shadows that the elders would use to illustrate their stories. Imagine being a kid, tucked into a pile of furs, watching a shadow play of a great hunt or a creation myth projected onto the very walls that are keeping the wind at bay. It was immersive cinema thousands of years before IMAX and significantly more relaxing. The storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was a way to keep the brain from dwelling on the fact that there was a wall of ice just a few inches from your head.
There's a certain dry irony in how the Europeans who eventually showed up thought these dwellings were primitive. Those same Europeans were often living in wooden shacks where the wind whistled through the gaps in the logs and the ink in their wells would freeze solid overnight. Meanwhile, the indigenous families were sitting in their thermodynamically superior cones, probably wondering why the newcomers looked so miserable and blue. Every part of the teepee was a choice. The poles were usually lodgepole pine, light, flexible, and strong. They'd creak and flex in the wind, acting like a shock absorber. If the wind hit a rigid house, the house cracked. If the wind hit a teepee, the teepee just leaned into it and whispered back. It was a conversation with the environment, rather than a fight against it. And then there was the morning, if you could even call it that, when the sun barely peeks over the horizon. You'd see the frost on the tips of the poles, where the moisture from the family's breath had frozen. But inside the tea was already steeping over the embers, the robes were warm, and the world was still quiet.
The nomadic shiver. There's a very specific kind of irony in the idea of moving house when it's minus 30 degrees Celsius. For most of us, moving across town in the summer is a nightmare. But for a plains tribe, moving an entire village in the dead of winter was just a very cold, very slow Tuesday. They used a device called a travois. Now, if you haven't seen one, imagine two long poles, often the very same poles used for the teepee, hitched to a dog or later a horse. You'd strap your entire life onto this A-frame drag, the hides, the dried meat, and occasionally the kids who were too small to wade through the knee-deep drifts. It was a silent procession. You wouldn't hear the clatter of wheels or the roar of an engine, just the shush-shush of wooden poles sliding over the crusty snow and the rhythmic breathing of the pack animals. It was a masterpiece of minimalist living. You didn't own anything that couldn't be folded, rolled, or dragged. It makes our modern obsession with storage units look a bit, well, silly, doesn't it? But let's talk about the winter count. Because when you're spending that much time inside a circle of buffalo hide, you start to look at the walls. The walls weren't just insulation, they were the community's hard drive. A winter count was a chronological record, usually painted in a spiral on a hide. Each year, each winter, was represented by a single pictograph that captured the most notable event of that season. One year might be the year the crows stole the meat, and another might be the year of the heavy slush. It's such a beautifully low-key way of keeping time. They didn't care about January or February. They cared about the experience of the cold. You'd be sitting there in the dim light, tracing the spiral with your finger, looking at the drawings of your ancestors who survived winters even worse than the one you were currently in. It was a visual reminder that this too shall pass. It's hard to feel like the world is ending when you're looking at a drawing of your great-grandfather surviving the year the stars fell. It puts your cold toes into perspective. And then there's the communal aspect of the snow itself. While the teepee was a private family space, the village was a living organism. When a heavy snow hit, the young men would go out and clear paths between the teepees. They weren't using steel shovels. They used the shoulder blades of elk or buffalo. Imagine the sound of bones scraping on ice in the blue light of a sub-zero morning. It's a very lonely, very sharp sound. They would bank the snow against the sides of the teepees, as we mentioned before, creating a sort of white trench system. From above, the village would have looked like a collection of smoking volcanoes rising out of a white sea. There was also a certain dry humor to the winter chores. Melting snow for water sounds easy until you realize how much snow it takes to make a single pot of tea. You're basically spending all day hauling frozen fluff just to get a few sips of liquid. It was a constant cycle of gathering wood, melting snow, and checking the smoke ears, those flaps at the top. If the wind shifted suddenly, someone had to go outside, braving the minus 30 degrees Celsius air for just a few seconds to adjust the exterior poles that controlled the flaps. You'd jump out, move the pole, and dive back into the furs like a seal retreating to a blowhole.
It was a high-stakes game of tag with the frostbite, and usually the humans won. And in the evenings, when the wind would really start to pick up, that high, whistling scream that sounds like a person crying out on the prairie, the stories would get longer, the humor would get a bit drier. They'd tell stories about Iktomi, the trickster spider, who was always getting himself into trouble because he was too proud or too lazy. It was a way of teaching the kids that out here, pride and laziness were the two things that would get you killed faster than the cold. As you listened to the fire pop and the wind rattle the hide walls, you realized that these people weren't just enduring the winter, they were mastering it. They had turned one of the most hostile environments on Earth into a place where a baby could sleep soundly in a moss bag, warm and dry, while the world outside turned to glass. It makes you wonder, as you settle deeper into your own blankets, if we've lost something in our centrally heated, square-walled lives. There's something to be said for the circle, the smoke, and the quiet knowledge that you have everything you need to survive the night right there on your back.
Bitter herbs and bone dice. When you're living in a humid, enclosed space with several other humans and a dog or two while it's minus 30 degrees Celsius outside, things can get a bit aromatic. But more importantly, things can get a bit sickly. The Plains people were essentially masters of the prehistoric pharmacy, and winter was when those skills really had to shine. Because honestly, having a chest cold when the nearest drugstore is a frozen thicket 3 miles away is a bit of a disaster. Let's talk about the tea. It wasn't just for comfort, it was medicine. They'd reach into their winter stores for dried rose hips, which, as it turns out, are absolutely packed with vitamin C. Long before anyone knew what a vitamin was, they knew that if you didn't drink the itchy berry tea, your gums started to bleed and you got sluggish. It was a very practical, very quiet way of avoiding scurvy while the world was buried in 6 feet of snow. They'd also brew up willow bark. Now, if you've ever taken an aspirin, you've essentially taken willow bark. It contains salicin. So if you had a pounding headache from the smoky air or a fever that made the buffalo robes feel like lead, you'd sip on this incredibly bitter, woody liquid. It didn't taste like a pumpkin spice latte, but it did the job. You'd sit there, grimacing at the bitterness, while the natural painkillers slowly numbed the edges of the winter's bite. It was a slow-motion healthcare system that worked in perfect harmony with the slow-motion life of the teepee. But once the physical aches were managed, you had to deal with the boredom. And let me tell you, boredom at minus 30 degrees Celsius is a very different beast. You couldn't just go for a walk. You couldn't scroll through your phone. You had to entertain each other, which, depending on your family members, was either a blessing or a very long trial. This is where the games of chance came in. One of the favorites was the plum stone game, or bone dice. You'd have a little basket and a set of carved stones or plum pits marked with different symbols. You'd shake them up and see how they landed. It sounds simple, because it was, but when there's nothing else to do, the stakes for a handful of bone dice felt like the Super Bowl. There was a lot of dry, snarky commentary during these games. If your uncle kept losing, he wasn't just unlucky, he was clearly being punished by the spirits for that one time he missed a buffalo at point-blank range. It was a way to keep the social gears greased. You'd play for small things, a bit of extra tobacco, a decorative bead, or just the right to gloat for the next 3 hours. It was gentle, it was repetitive, and it was perfectly designed to kill time without burning too many calories. And then there was the hand game, or the hiding game. 2 teams, a small bone hidden in a hand, and a whole lot of rhythmic singing and swaying to distract the other side. Imagine the scene, the firelight casting huge dancing shadows of people swaying back and forth, the low melodic chanting humming through the hide walls, and the wind providing the percussion. It was a sensory cocoon. You weren't just playing a game, you were creating a wall of sound and motion that pushed back against the crushing silence of the frozen prairie. It's an interesting contrast, really.
Outside, the world was frozen solid, immobile, and silent enough that you could hear a twig snap a mile away. But inside the teepee, it was a world of constant low-level vibration. The hum of stories, the clicking of bone dice, the bubbling of the willow bark tea. It was a small, warm bubble of humanity floating in a cold, black ocean. Of course, even the most patient person eventually wanted some space, but in a teepee, space was a mental construct. You learned to leave the room by simply pulling your robe over your head or turning your back to the circle. It was a silent agreement. If someone's robe is up, they aren't there. It was a primitive version of do not disturb mode, and it was the only thing keeping everyone from losing their minds. As the embers start to fade and the bone dice are tucked back into their pouches, the teepee settles into its deepest quiet. The winter count on the wall keeps its secrets, and the family drifts off one by one into the heavy pemmican-fueled sleep of the survivor.
The frozen sentinel and the first drip. When it's minus 30 degrees Celsius, you aren't the only one trying to keep your blood liquid. Outside the hide walls, the horses and dogs were engaged in their own quiet struggle. Now, you'd think a horse would just freeze solid standing there, but the relationship between the plains people and their animals was, well, it was a bit like a long-term roommate agreement where neither side speaks, but everyone knows the rules. The horses were often moved into the river bottoms or coulees, anywhere the geography offered a break from that relentless, bone-shaving wind. But when the snow got too deep for them to forage, the humans had to step in. You'd see people venturing out into the stinging cold to scrape bark from cottonwood trees. Cottonwood bark was the emergency rations of the prairie. A bit bitter, sure, but full of enough nutrients to keep a horse's internal engine turning. It's a pretty humbling image, a person who is already freezing, carving bark off a tree to feed an animal that will eventually carry their home to the next camp. It's the ultimate pay-it-forward system. And then there were the dogs. Before horses arrived, dogs were the primary movers of the plains. In the winter, they were the early warning system. If a wolf or a stranger was moving through the muffled, snowy silence, the dogs would know. Often, on the most brutal nights, the most prized dogs, or the puppies, would be brought right inside the teepee. Because why not add a furry, breathing heater to the mix? A dog sleeping at your feet under a buffalo robe is essentially a living hot water bottle. It's a bit of a win-win. The dog doesn't turn into an ice sculpture, and you get to keep your toes. There's a certain dry, cozy irony in the fact that thousands of years of human evolution led us to the realization that sitting near a warm dog is the peak of survival technology. But eventually, the long dark starts to shift. You don't see it first, you hear it. After months of the silence of ice, that sharp, brittle silence, there comes a day when the sun stays up just a few minutes longer. The light changes from a cold, piercing blue to a slightly softer, almost golden hue. And then you hear it, the drip. It's the sound of the snow banking against the teepee finally starting to lose its structural integrity. It starts as a tiny, rhythmic plink, plink, plink against the lower hides. Inside the teepee, that sound is better than any symphony. It means the winter count is about to add a new mark. It means the pemmican stores might actually last. It means you might soon see a horizon that isn't just a flat white line. But the long thaw was its own kind of messy disaster. As the temperature rose to just above freezing, the teepee, which had been a dry, cozy sanctuary, became a bit of a damp challenge. The floor would get soft. The buffalo hides would get heavy with moisture. This was the transition period where everyone's snarkiness probably peaked. You're no longer in survival mode, you're just in annoyed and damp mode. You'd see the women of the camp checking the sinew stitching on the hides, making sure the expansion and contraction of the freezing and thawing hadn't pulled the house apart. It was a time of maintenance, a slow, methodical checking of every pole and every peg. They were preparing for the spring winds, which were often more violent than the winter blizzards.
As the first patches of brown grass started to peek through the crusty snow, the mood in the village would lift. The games of chance became a little louder. The stories moved from creation myths to plans for the spring hunt. The circle of the teepee remained, but the walls felt less like a fortress and more like a temporary skin again. There's a profound lesson in that minus 30 degrees Celsius vigil. It's the realization that comfort isn't about having a thermostat on the wall or a paved driveway. It's about the thickness of a robe, the quality of a story, and the knowledge that your primitive cone is actually a masterpiece of engineering that the wind can't break. As you finally drift off to sleep tonight, just imagine that sound, the low groan of the lodge poles, the scent of the willow tea, and the absolute unwavering warmth of a buffalo robe while the rest of the world is frozen solid. It's a pretty good way to go out.
The legacy of the circle. When the winter finally broke and the village prepared to move, they didn't leave much behind. Maybe some packed down circles in the grass and the ashes of a fire that had burned for 4 months. It's the ultimate leave-no-trace lifestyle, practiced centuries before it became a trendy bumper sticker. But the influence of that design didn't just melt away with the snow. Even today, architects and survivalists look at the teepee with a kind of hushed reverence. In a world of square rooms and rigid corners, the teepee reminds us that a circle is actually the strongest shape you can inhabit. It handles stress better, it circulates air better, and, honestly, it's just a lot more psychologically soothing. There's something about a lack of corners that prevents the mind from feeling boxed in during a blizzard. It's hard to feel trapped in a space that has no end. The philosophy of the plains winter was one of radical acceptance. You didn't fight the negative 30 degrees Celsius cold because you can't fight the sky. You just leaned into it. You made your walls out of the very animals that lived in the wind, and you fueled your body with the plants that slept beneath the ice. It was a partnership, not a conquest. When we think about those families today, tucked away in their buffalo hide cones while the stars crackled with frost above them, it's easy to feel a bit of modern pity. But then you look at our own world, the flickering screens, the humming heaters that dry out our skin, the frantic pace of a life that never pauses for the seasons. There's a certain dry irony in the fact that we've traded the winter count for a digital calendar that's always full. Maybe that's why the image of the teepee in the snow is so enduring. It represents a time when success was simply staying warm, staying fed, and having a good story to tell when the sun came back. It was a life of profound focus. As the morning light finally hits the smoke flaps in our story, and the first person of the day steps out into the crisp, blindingly white air, they aren't looking for a reveal or a twist. They're just looking at the horizon to see if the buffalo are moving. They're breathing in air so cold it feels like drinking diamonds, and they're doing it with the calm of someone who knows exactly how their world works. So, as you settle into your own bed tonight, maybe take a second to appreciate your walls, but also maybe imagine what it would be like to hear the wind howling across 1,000 miles of grass, only to have it slide harmlessly over your head because you were smart enough to live in a cone. The fire is low, the robes are heavy, the winter is long, but the circle is holding. Sleep well.